tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we've been looking at this list called the Fetters, the 10 Fetters, and these are essentially very entrenched hindrances or errors in view that hold the heart back from the freedom of awakening. And they are traditionally listed with a correspondence to 4 levels of awakening or enlightenment. I prefer the word awakening. The first of these is stream entry, the second is once return, the third is non-return, and the fourth is arahant or perfection. And for the last 3 weeks, we talked about the fetters that are given up with the attainment of stream entry, which is the doorway to awakening, sometimes called the opening of the Dharma eye. And so with stream entry, entering the stream of the Dhamma, one is said to give up or have, fall away from one's view. Sakkaya ditthi, which is personality view, really the felt sense that there's a permanent abiding individual implied by the ever-changing process of experience. Doubt in the path, since we've just had this marvelous awakening and have recovered from the error of personality view, doubt also falls away. You realize that the path works. And in the same vein, belief that anything other than the path could work to awaken one, and particularly practices like ritual and magic, the idea that they could bring about awakening directly. We talked about them being, not useless, not pointless, not unreal, but simply tools for different purposes, and that it's really the path of the Dhamma that is the tool for the purpose of this very specific awakening, stream entry and beyond. So there you are, a stream enterer, as you're called, and you've had this profound insight into the nature of your individual self and the goodness of the path and what that path consists of and what it doesn't. Now what? And mostly what seems to happen in the texts and in, the instructions given at this point, the instructions often get quite vague at this point, and there are some controversies around what if one actually changes one's practice to go from stream entry to once return, or whether you just keep doing the same kind of practice. And I'm not going to go into those controversies or ideas. A lot of that comes out of folks in different modernist Vipassana traditions arguing with each other, or internally about, whether you continue with the exact same kind of method, like Mahasi method or Goenka method or something, to move from one stage to the next. In the Buddha's discourses, there are a lot of situations where someone hears a Dharma talk by the Buddha and just awakens fully all at once. So all the scales drop from their eyes, they become an arahant, you're done, right? And they announce that they're done. There's other times where it's announced that someone, is a certain, at a certain place on the path. And there's places where the Buddha surveys the whole Sangha and says, there are folks here who are arahants, there are folks here who are non-returners, who are once returners, who are stream enterers, who are practicing towards stream entry. So there's clearly an understanding that these are, sequential stages on the path. And the names themselves, once return, non-return, refer to the idea that when a practitioner becomes a stream enterer, they are guaranteed full awakening, so arahantship, perfection, in 7 lifetimes or less, including this one. So that's taken by many traditions, including many modernist traditions, as the most important goal in practice. Just get folks to stream entry, and then, as a teacher, kind of like your job here is done. Because even if they just like lollygag the rest of this lifetime, they're still like, they're destined for, they're going to make it, and they're not going to be reborn in hell or as an animal or as a hungry ghost ever again. The next stage, once return, means this person will be reborn only one more time in the human realm and then become an arahant. Non-return is very, very similar, and the fetters that move are very, very similar. The non-returner is born only once more in a formless realm. So there are heaven realms that are associated with some of the deep meditative states, especially the formless meditative states, boundless space, boundless consciousness, nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception. And you can get born as a kind of a deva or a deity, essentially spending your whole lifetime in that subtle state. It's almost not like you're really a being at that point. You are. You're the manifestation of a karmic stream. But it's sort of like if you attain non-returnerness and you die, you kind of enter that meditative state, whichever one you were kind of peaking at. You get really good at abiding in the base of infinite consciousness. The second of the arupas, the formless states, is sometimes called sixth jhana. And when you're dying, you enter that state, and because it's the most refined state and then you just stay in that state for some very long period of time. And upon emerging from that state, you attain arahantship and then die, and you're done. So it's a kind of, it is a rebirth, but it's a very, very subtle one. And then with arahantship, you are no longer reborn into suffering. And so, and like we always say when we're talking about rebirth, you can think of these as literal materialistic descriptions. Like you have a kind of consciousness that gets reborn somewhere, but of course then, what is that consciousness? I like to think of them as not literal, but also not just metaphorical. That they do refer to something real that happens. And the usual explanation is something like, the term that I like the most is momentum. That, when one object hits another object, momentum is transferred from one object to the other. So if one, rolling ball hits another static ball, that momentum can get transferred from the first ball to the second one, and the second one can go on. They're totally different balls. They're totally, you get reborn, it's a totally different body, but it's carrying some force or charge from the previous situation. And so that force, that momentum is kama or karma. It's the force that accrues in your ever-evolving process based on your actions and your responses to the conditions you find yourself in. So kama or karma is this invisible but palpable force kind of pressing us forward. And it expresses largely as desire, right? You want something. You still want something to happen, whether it's positive or negative, whether you actively want something or to start happening or happen more, or you want something bad to stop happening or happen less. There's a wanting. And so when we go from stream entry to once returner, and I'm not speaking from direct experience here, so this is all just from the texts, but I want you to know the structure. The sense is that the fetters that are affected, that move in the transition from being a stream enterer to being a once returner, is that sensual desire, kāmacchanda, and hatred or ill will, vyāpāda, are weakened. They are not eliminated. So with stream entry, you get to uproot 3 nasty weeds from your garden. Woohoo, done. No more Sakkaya Ditthi, no more doubt, no more, unskillful belief in rites and rituals. When you attain, but you still have all the rest, right? Including these 2 biggies, sense desire and ill will. And you might notice that these are the first 2 hindrances, and that the hindrances ideally have been weakening throughout your whole practice, and that particularly they are completely set aside when you're in samadhi. So one of the definitions of being in samadhi or jhana, deep meditative state, is that all of the hindrances are settled for now. They're not active. And so it's already the case that sense desire and ill will can be weakened, can be diminished or even set aside for a time in samadhi, but they come back when you come out of samadhi, or your state changes. Greed or lust or wanting, unskillful desire can come roaring back in. You may know something about how that feels. And of course, hatred and ill will can come roaring back in, and you might know something about that. So with once return, both of these are weakened, and then with non-return, they are uprooted, right? Leaving the last 5 hindrances, all of the last 5, remain with you through being a non-returner, and they only are entirely uprooted with arahantship. So it's an unequal list, right? You ditch 3 in the beginning, then you weaken the next 2, then you eliminate the next 2, and then you get all 5 at the end. So that's how that structure works. And you might understand, it might make just sense how, what's up with like once return and non-return. Once return is like the weakening of sense desire and ill will. If we think about kama, this force that propels rebirth, as really woven by these 2 forces, right? These 2 like ethically charged emotions, basically. Desire is an ethically charged emotion because it impels you to do things, right? Hatred or ill will is an ethically charged emotion because it impels you to do things, to say things that might be unskillful or harmful. And so these are the feelings that push us into the future. Desire wants something and then maybe tries to get it, right? Ill will hates something and tries to do something about that. And so when you weaken these, you diminish their capacity to propel you forward. And so maybe you weaken them to the point that like, okay, it's going to take one more lifetime to defeat them fully, but you can do it. And, they're weak enough that, one more round in the ring. And the Buddha was a Kshatriya warrior, so we can go with martial imagery here. One more round, and it's KO for these deep hindrances, for these fetters. So once returners have weakened them, and then once you fully eliminate them, you no longer want or hate anything of the senses. But 2 of the higher fetters, the ones that only disappear with arahantship, are desire for subtle states, right? And aversion to coarse states. We'll get to, so you still want something. You still want your meditation to be like lovely, but you're done with desire for the objects of the senses. And so being done with that, you can be reborn into a formless realm. You still desire that because it's lovely, but you're done with needing a body to satisfy your desires. So that's how it feels like the once return and non-return relate directly to these 2 fetters of sense desire and ill will. So let's feel into sense desire a bit. It's kāmacchanda. Chanda is the desire or wanting, and kama is sensuality. You might know the term from the Kama Sutra, for instance, which is this old Indian, not Buddhist, but Indian kind of sex manual that got very popular in the 70s. And so it's, the manual for how to do sensuality well, in a certain medieval kind of way. So kāmacchanda, it's often translated as sensual desire. I like the translation sense desire because the term sensual, for many of us, leans substantially in the direction of the sexual. It's sort of like soft sexual. But sensual really, I think more specifically points to the sensuality, the eros of our relationship to the experience of any of the senses, right? So delighting in delicious tastes is sensual. Delighting in scents is sensual. Delighting in physical contact is sensual. Delighting in sounds, how much of my life have I spent delighting in sounds? I was a musician for a long time. So many of us adore music. When you're listening to some good music next time you are, and how often do you? Maybe very often, right? But even if it's just around somewhere and you notice you like it, see if you can notice the sensuality of liking music, that there's these sounds that are being crafted and they just do something to the psyche, to the heart, to the body. They create vibration and they move you and sometimes very, very viscerally, right? So this is it's a sense pleasure, right? And you could meditate on it. You could hear the sounds of good music. You could notice the Vedana, the feeling tone, how pleasant. Really tune into the pleasantness. And then you could notice if you have desire for more, I want this to go on longer, or I want to like this track on Spotify, or I'm going to text this track to my friend, or I'm going to go to their concert, or I'm going to buy their album, if anyone does that anymore. I'm going to set up the conditions for me to experience this sensual pleasure more in the future. So that's kāmacchanda. I have, I really love for visual kāmacchanda, of course, there's a million things to delight visually in this world. I love aspects of nature. I love certain kinds of human bodies. I love all sorts of pretty things. One of the beautiful things that I happen to love is some of the paintings of the abstract expressionist school, particularly the New Yorkers. And ever since my early 20s, when I saw it for the first time, I've had a favorite Rauschenberg that's hanging in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And it's just a delight. It's a riot of color. There's collaged cartoons on it. There's drips. There's big panels of color. There's tiny little bits. There's a tiny little mirror embedded in the center of it. On the very top of it, there's perched some funky little wooden shapes that he just kind of glued on the top of the canvas for absurd reasons. And when I saw it the first time, it just kind of stopped me, and I was like, that's, and I didn't even know what to say about it. And the feeling was kind of like, dude, like, good going, like, Bob, like, that's fabulous, right? And I was just like, damn it, Rauschenberg, you really got me. And so it became my favorite painting for a while. And in a marvelous, eerie coincidence, several years later, I met my birth mother. I was adopted, and she was an artist. And so I met her when I was in my early 20s. And at some point, she sent me a birthday card. And I don't recall ever having told her the story. We didn't have very many conversations. I barely met her. She sent me a birthday card of this exact Rauschenberg painting. And so that was lovely, a little bit eerie and cosmic. It's a lovely painting. And in all the years since, we go to the MoMA every once in a while. Can't afford to go very much, but we go sometimes. And we took our toddler there. I have a picture of my toddler at like 1.5 in front of the Rauschenberg, just bopping around. And I can feel whenever we're going to go there, there's always going to be a bunch of good stuff to experience, but I can feel just the delight of going into that gallery. It's permanently on view, and I just get to go there and say hello to this painting that I love, and that so it's a sensual experience to have this visual relationship that I have a desire to renew, right? I want to see it again. So kāmacchanda is active in our relationship to experiences through all the senses, right? It's fall here, but down in the southern hemisphere it's spring, and so here's in the chat from beautiful Australia, delighting in the heady spring scent of freesias. Freesias, if anyone knows that smell, brief but beautiful. Yeah, so I think in Western Buddhist cultures, often progressive ones, less fundamentalist ones, I'm not sure what I am in there, but we often, really obliquely teach, this fetter as a fetter, because so many of us have come through, the ancestry and cultural heritage of body-hating, sensuality-hating, fierce, afraid of sexuality, afraid of the feminine, which was often associated with sexuality, which was associated with the earth. Layers of layers of oppressive discourse that have been afraid, of and even hateful towards sensuality for so long, that many of us in many communities that I've been a part of have had to do, I think, a very deep work of reclaiming eros, reclaiming sensuality, reclaiming sexuality, reclaiming sensuality and sexuality and the life of the body from so many forms of oppressive power that that have been crushing to human spirit. And so in a way, I think that even in Dharma communities, often as a resistance against these histories of oppression, it's more helpful to uplift the beauty and righteousness and radicalness of a liberated eros than it is to emphasize that, kāmacchanda is a fetter that will keep you bound in the wheel of rebirth, So mostly we do the work of liberating eros from patriarchal oppressive structures. So I think that's important. At the same time, I don't actually want to avoid the implication that the Buddha is pulling out, that it is this very thing that is most beautiful in human experience in the world, that it is this that keeps us here. And, maybe we spin it in a way that I think a lot of contemporary practitioners spin it. I think this is rooted in privilege, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, to say, well, yeah, samsara is beautiful. Life in the world is gorgeous and subtle and mysterious and alive and filled with, eros in a kind of divine way. We can connect with that. And still, we can notice that the underlying intuition that the Buddha had, we could respect. We can say, oh, and this being the case, it is eros that keeps us here. And we could recognize this. I wonder if we can recognize this in a way that both honors its extraordinary power and beauty in the world, and understands that the Buddha's intuition is correct. That if you have come to the feeling that you're done with suffering. You're done with participating in an endless, lifetime after lifetime, cosmic stream of disappointment and angst and fear and suffering. And you're ready to uproot the conditions for more of that. That you necessarily have to uproot the whole thing. That you can't continue to participate with the beautiful without continuing to participate in the unsatisfying. Because the beautiful and the unsatisfying are woven together, right? It's possible, it's clearly possible to experience beauty without grasping at that beauty, right? And I think this is the carrot of the Dhamma. There's the idea that, like, in this lifetime, you could open your heart in such an extraordinary new way that you are available for the extraordinary beauties of the world. You know them for what they are, and you're not entranced by them as an object of future action. You don't need more, right? Like, I could shift my experience of that Rauschenberg to where I just purely delight in it. I know it in the depth of my being as a beautiful thing that a human created, and bows to him and his friends, for making that scene and making that thing possible. And it would be okay if I never saw it again. But could I do that, about everything? I think this is something that we aspire to, even not just in the Dhamma, but, anyone with an eye to dying well. I think, we see aspects of this come out in poems, like, to really experience your last sunset or your last, smell of freesias in the springtime, and to be able to experience it fully without grasping at experiencing it again. I think this is the experience of the one who's awakened. Because once you no longer are grasping at experiencing it again, you're losing the momentum that would lead you to grasp at being reborn in order to experience it again. I know I have to come back. I have to smell the freesias in the springtime, or I have to see the Rauschenberg again, or I have to make love again. I'm not done with the deliciousness of the world, right? There's more I want to do or experience through my senses. And so I think we can find in ourselves, we can practice as a community also, the kind of maturity of view that doesn't have to default to an anti-embodiment, pleasure stance in order to know something about renunciation, deep letting go, dispassion, disenchantment for ourselves. These are all not quite synonyms, but they're aspects of the final unbinding just before full liberation. Disenchantment, dispassion, really layers of letting go, letting go, letting go. And so when we soften, when we weaken sensual desire to the point where maybe there's enough momentum that we'll still be reborn once, but really not beyond that. I think the idea here is that we are coming finally to the kind of mature presence in the sensual world that is awake to the full picture of what sensuality means. That being engaged with sensuality, that it's a kind of delusion to think that I can just live my life hopping from one beautiful flower to the next and never experience the winter or the dying of the flower or the loss of the nectar or the death of the hive. That this is the delusion that leads to endless rebirth, which is the idea that things will be okay if I can just keep the pleasures coming a pleasure fades away, but I can get a new one, right? And I remember the feeling of being in my early mid-20s maybe. I didn't have a lot of like intimate relationships. I wished that I had found more, but I didn't in those years. But I remember the feeling of there being a long future stretched out ahead of me, where there was always the possibility that I could find intimacy or love someday, right? It wasn't a finite thing. And I'm now twice as old as that person who had that feeling, and it doesn't feel like that anymore, right? Now I can feel how, besides that I'm married and I'm not out shopping for more intimate relationships, but I can just feel how I'm no longer in that bloom of youth where there's just like endless people around that I might date, but I probably won't, but that's okay because there's possibility. If that haunts me, if I can't really get over that, that is kāmacchanda, right? I'm desiring a kind of intimate contact that I can't have, or maybe I could, but it gets more and more, tied up with like, who knows how many years I have left even, right? And it's all changing. And even if lots of that happened now, it's not happening to my 25-year-old self, my 30-year-old self, right? That's gone. And so as we come to maturity about what it means to desire, that maturity will include the whole picture of what it means to live a life within sensuality, a life in the realm of the senses. And that no matter how beautiful, how intoxicating, the truth of impermanence, the truth of decay and loss always comes in, right? And there's a beauty in decay and loss, and you can learn that to appreciate that beauty, to appreciate the dying flower as much as the blossoming one. But the more we do this, and this is why the meditations on death are part of the practice, the more we do this, I think our eros matures, our sense of what it means, but also just what it feels like to be intimate with the world matures. I think the proposal that the Buddha is making is that it's possible for our eros, our relationship to eros, or relationship to the world, to mature radically, far beyond what we usually think of it as maturing as. It's not just that we become a wise elder and we don't grasp so much at the lusts and greeds and wants of our youth, that moment when you're no longer craving a promotion at work, right? Like, no, I'm close to retirement. I'm not doing that anymore. That's a young person's game, But beyond that, to not crave anything of this world, to be sated, to be satisfied. I think the Buddha is not pushing away the world. His very first teaching, the first sentence of his teaching that he says to his friends is, "I found the middle way between sensual indulgence and mortification," which is a kind of like radical rejection of sensuality. His way neither indulges nor rejects. The middle way doesn't try to satisfy sense desire by having more of it, neither does it try to get rid of it by rejecting sensual contact. Right? There's a middle way, and what that middle way is will be different for each of us. There's a monastic middle way, there's a lay middle way, there's an antique middle way, time of the Buddha, there's a modern middle way. I think for any of us, the middle is a place we can feel where we are neither indulging nor rejecting. And there's a kind of sweet spot there. And I think we refresh that over the life of our practice, because as we mature, our relationship to sensuality naturally changes. And we'll see in more and more subtlety the ways we grasp, the ways we resist, the ways that we don't want to let go of those last deluded ideas that maybe, with just a little bit more of something, we'll get what we want. And in the end, right? That weakens, and eventually falls away. And when it falls away, then the rest of one's life, it just feels radically different. The way you just feel different than you did when you were grasping at something in your youth that you no longer grasp at. And I think the invitation is for us to feel toward what it would be like to feel that free, but in relation to everything. All right, so pausing there. Thanks for being investigators of this kind of layer of our being.